What a glorious Easter. Choir, you did it again. You're a twofer today. Amen. So thank you so much for the music, for the story, for everything that brings us to this place at this time. It just makes me remember that old movie, The Lion King, when Rafiki senses that Simba is still around. You see the little leaves flying and the music starts playing, and then Rafiki goes, "He is alive." That's how I'm feeling right now. It's just a glorious, glorious time to be present. And y'all know I'm a Billy Collins fan, and so in his very wry 2003 poem on poetry, he wrote this: "All they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means." Anyone else feel that way when they took poetry in high school English? I've often felt that way about the resurrection story. We tie up with pretty ribbons, maybe with Easter grass, or conversely with thorny vines or rough-hewn twine, and we beat it to death with all sorts of theological questions to find out what resurrection really means. I mean, preachers, we spend hours trying to find fresh twists on the story. And worship leaders' creativity knows no bounds as they strive to portray the message of Easter in a way that is captivating and memorable. And communications leaders, they work overtime to lure people to their particular Easter celebration. Who has the best Easter egg hunt in town? Or who's got the best donuts and coffee? I mean, I have seen both of those things on mass mailings in my mailbox this week and on my Facebook feed, trying to get me to come to their particular church. As a result, the way that we respond to the resurrection is as varied as we are a congregation. While Easter is a high holy day for believers, however it is we believe, and there are those in this room who have definitely experienced Lent and Holy Week and Easter in remarkable ways, many of you are here today not because you really want to be, but because someone you love thought it was important to come to church together on Easter Sunday. But whatever your motivation may be for being here this morning, I hope that you will give the Easter message a chance to make a difference in the way that you think about life. And as I have been musing about the resurrection, I can't help but reflect that this glorious message of hope that's so prevalent during this season, still much of human life today comes across as so futile, so tragic, so short, so sad. Each week we hear stories, we lift up prayer requests, we struggle with family members who are in crisis. If Christ has risen, and we speak often of being risen with Christ, then why do so many people experience their life as tragic more than triumphant? And those questions, they keep coming. Why is there nonstop war? Why are there so many people unjustly imprisoned? Why are the poor oppressed? Why, even in Christian nations, is there a long history of deceit and injustice? Why do so few marriages last, even among those of us who say that we believe? Why is it that we destroy so many of our relationships? And the question why continues. And so we find ourselves asking, God, what are you up to? When and where and how is this resurrection thing really happening? Is it only after death? Is it only in the next world? Because it sure is hard to see it happening today. My guess is that it's both now and later, and just enough now to promise us an infinite forever. But I think that the resurrection of Christ is telling us that the arc of history is always moving toward resurrection. God's final judgment is that God will have the last word, that there are no dead ends, that our lives and human history is not going to end in a sad and tragic list of human crucifixions and natural disasters. Now, in this part of the world, Easter coincides with springtime. And here in southern Arizona, the wildflowers this year are amazingly prolific. And the temperatures are finally warming up after months of extremely strange weather. You know, I run at about 5 o'clock each morning, and now the sun is rising by the end of my runs. And it won't be long before I won't need a headlamp at the start. And there is nothing more beautiful than watching the sun rise over the Rincon Mountains in the east. Sunrises and springtime cannot be stopped, even when winter seems to be holding us in its desperate grip. And so our Easter story begins at sunrise. And Mary Magdalene is our preacher of the day. It was dark, and she gets to the tomb, and she discovers that the stone is rolled away. And so she immediately goes to tell Peter and John what she has seen. And at those words, don't you think it's really odd that all of a sudden it becomes a race? And John gets there first, and he thinks it's important enough to put in writing that he beat Peter. He outpaces him, and then he gets there first, and he stops at the entrance. And he looks inside, but he waits for the big guy to get there to go in first. And both of them see the grave cloths neatly folded and the tomb empty of the body that they expected to see there. But it was only when they saw that fact for themselves that they believed Mary's words. And at that time, at that moment, what it all meant was simply that someone had to have taken Jesus' body and put it somewhere else. None of them had any inkling of what it meant to rise from the dead, or that Jesus did it. That came later. Meanwhile, they went back to where they were staying, puzzled by what they had seen. But we read that Mary stayed. Like all the women had stayed during the crucifixion when all the other disciples had abandoned Jesus. Like they stayed when he was put in the tomb. And because Mary came back as soon as she could after the mandatory Sabbath rest and stayed, she experienced the rest of the story in a way that no one else did. And how did she share that story, the rest of the story, with the disciples? Well, she didn't give an explanation. She didn't preach a sermon or cry out, as Reverend Matt had the children do earlier, "He is risen! He is risen indeed!" But instead, Mary comes before the disciples and she simply says, "I have seen the Lord." Resurrection, you see, is not a third-person confession, something that you can, in Billy Collins' words, tie up to a chair and torture an explanation out of. Nor is it something that you can simply rationalize away because it is so improbable. Nor can you simply relegate it to a nice slogan that we say to each other at this time of year. Rather, it is a first-person testimony. You see, resurrection is not something that just comes up once a year in church. It's a truth that each and every one of us can witness each and every day of our lives. And we all need to hear the invitation, the encouragement, the promise that each of us can say, "I have seen the Lord," in our own lives and in our own way. To say, "I have seen the Lord," is to point out resurrection in the midst of ruin, new life when all that seems visible is death, love in the face of hatred, decency and goodness when that which is vitriolic and vile and vicious finds only more and more followers. Because in the end, resurrection is not only the promise of life after death, but also the assurance that the life-giving love of God will always move the stones away. Tombs are just that, you see, they're containers for the dead. And while it seems that we seem rather content these days with such spaces, those dead places that fuel corruption and deception, racism, sexism, suspicion, rejection, marginalization, misogyny, judgment, and fear, God continues to roll those stones away that keep life at bay. And when the stale air of decay meets God's breath that creates new life and the possibility of hope and peace, then death is truly no more. The promise of the resurrection is not only secure because God made it so by raising Jesus from the dead. The promise of the resurrection is certain when we speak into our own lives. I have seen the Lord. Words which roll back stones that confine and constrain in order that all life may be free to know dignity and regard and respect. You see, I have seen the Lord insists that the ways of love will win over the ways of hate. I have seen the Lord confirms that the truth of kindness can be overheard over the din of ruthless, callous, and vindictive rhetoric. I have seen the Lord gives witness to the fact that there is another way of being in the world, a way of being that is shaped by resurrection, that embodies anything and everything that is life-giving, a way of being that is so countercultural, so demonstrative of mercy, so exemplary of the truth of Easter that others will listen to you, watch you, wonder about you, and say, wait a minute, did I just see the Lord? Not that the truth of the resurrection needs your action for verification. Not that the truth of the resurrection depends on your witness to convince others. Not that the truth of resurrection relies on your willingness to speak words of life into conversations intent on destruction, or your determination to free those captive to the deaths that our culture and our world perpetuate. You see, the truth of the resurrection is true regardless of your testimony. But maybe it will be more true for each and every one of us if we can walk out of church this Easter morning and be willing to say, I have seen the Lord. Be willing to look for where we can say, I have seen the Lord in your life. Or imagine those who might need us to say, I have seen the Lord, because they cannot. And why can't they? Because the resurrection stories have too long been portrayed as something they really are not. And so they have just stopped looking for God in the everyday moments of life. True resurrection is the truth that the resurrection of Jesus indeed matters for our future, but even more so for our present and for the sake of the present of others. Billy Collins, remember that poet from earlier? He expresses an openness to whatever's next in this resurrection life in these lines from one of his poems. But my heart is always propped up in a field next to on its tripod, ready for the next arrow. This is resurrection. A heart propped up, prepared to receive whatever is coming at it, resting sturdily on 3 legs, standing on higher ground, willingly allowing the next pierce of an arrow. And that's love, the power of God on earth. This is resurrection. Or as author N.T. Wright writes, the point of the resurrection is that the present bodily life is not valueless just because it will die. What you do with your body in the present matters because God has a great future in store for it. What you do in the present by painting, preaching, singing, praying, teaching, building hospitals, digging wells, campaigning for justice, writing poems, caring for the needy, loving your neighbor as yourself will last into God's future. Friends, Easter is the ultimate day of hope. Jesus is the stand-in for everybody. He gives history a personal, a historical, and a future hope. His one life tells us where it is all heading. This is the day of hope that says that God will have the last word, and that whatever we crucify, whatever we tragically destroy, God will undo with God's eternal love and forgiveness. This day affirms that God's final judgment is resurrection. That God will turn all that remains, all the destruction and hurt and punishment, into beauty. And the message of hope on Resurrection Sunday is simple and clear. Love is stronger than death. God's love will always win. Jesus walked through both life and death with love, which became an infinite life, a participation in God Himself. Surprise of all surprises. And this cannot be proven logically or rationally, and yet this is the mystery on which we now stake our life and our death. Nothing dies forever, and all that has died in love will be reborn in an even larger love. One might think that the rising of Jesus from the dead would be the end. I mean, how on earth could you top resurrection? But that was just the beginning of the hope that Jesus would bring to the world. Just the beginning. And for the rest of this Easter season, we will be exploring the message of living a life of hope as we look together at the greatest hope-filled message contained in the New Testament, the Revelation according to John. Alleluia and amen.